So when we look at intergenerational historical trauma, we understand that when we do this assessment, we want to look at it from really a biopsychosocial spiritual process, right? Social workers, we understand that. We understand the impact of social determinants of health or mental health, racism, structural racism, um, post-colonial policies and practices that were rooted in racist practices that we have inherited. And even though we have a conversation about post-coloniality and dismantling these things, we also see how these practices are still evident in our policies as we struggle with and continue to dismantle those things. We have to acknowledge the impact that also has on us, right? In terms of the personal environment, we understand the biological epigenetic factors. And again, I think that Dr. Beckles does a wonderful job in presenting some of this, some of those psychological cognitive impacts, spiritual factors and schema in terms of meaning of life and what we make of that, and sometimes how we approach certain situations when faced with challenges, right? And sometimes as social workers, these are things that we need to explore more with men. You know, hey, how do you deal with challenges? How do you face, when faced with a situation, how do you deal with that, right? And sometimes as men, just in conversation, we don't have those conversations, right? And it's something that we want to normalize, and we'll talk more about that as well. And I also talked about, in terms of social, the collective and individualized experience and worldview, right? So my worldview, my experiences growing up in Trinidad, Macoya Gardens, would be different from someone who was living in Chumaka, in Laventille, or certain parts of Laventille. While we all were in Trinidad, we were having different experiences, right? In terms of our individualized experiences. And this would be no different for you in Jamaica, in those terms of those who live in Kingston, New Kingston, those who live in uptown, downtown, all the different things that you are aware of in terms of how that manifests itself and how people understand this in terms of historical trauma. So the impact of trauma on health. And I think this is one of the areas that Dr. Beckles does a wonderful job in terms of understanding the intergenerational and historical trauma and the epigenetic impact that has had on us, right? Because if you look at the first slide, while we understand that all men face trauma, and I just want to go back to that slide, if I may, right? Because I think this is important to pay attention to this picture, right? While all people have experienced horrific situations, genocide, Holocaust, and so forth, right? While we know people have fled, for instance, in Trinidad, our Syrian and Lebanese community may have fled different types of persecutions, Chinese, so forth. But what happened to people of African ancestry was something quite unique in terms of the breaking up of families, right? This had never happened before in contemporary history or modern history that we can think of, right? In terms of the breaking up of families, separating families, people having to galvanize themselves and form new families. We cannot dismiss the impact that would have had. I know sometimes we like to say, well, this is in the past, but as we learn about trauma, we realize that these things can be intergenerational and the impact that it can have. And I want to assure you, I approach life from a strength-based perspective, but I also recognize the implications of that as we talked about some of those things. So I think it's important to address that, right? Also, as we talk about mental health and trauma, we realize what are some of the common issues that we see faced by individuals in the region, whether it's in Jamaica, whether it's in Trinidad, whether it's in Barbados, whether where I am here in Fayetteville, North Carolina, or where I was before in Atlanta, Georgia, or if we're looking at Mississippi or any of these areas where you find a large population of people of African ancestral origin, we see some of the issues, right, that common issues around depression, anxiety, PTSD, substance misuse. And sometimes men do not address these issues, right? And it manifests itself in these common things, right? And this is not new to you. As you work in your practicums, you experience this as you are doing your practicums with different communities, right? Also, the stigma and cultural norms discourage help-seeking behaviors, right? Because we know, I growing up in Trinidad, you said that you have a mental health problem, man. You're a madman or what? What going on with you? People look at you in a certain way. You weak, he mad, that fella, yeah, right? So people start making fun of you, right? And particularly for men. And sometimes men, as you know, we are not comfortable because we don't want to be seen in a position of being weak, right? Because to say that we have man, we're struggling with some issues, some anxieties around certain things. And I want to confess, I go through a lot of issues of anxiety. Sitting in this position as an associate dean, dealing with different issues in society, family stresses, and so on, it can cause anxiety, right? So if I myself don't have other individuals who I can have a conversation with, because I am afraid of the stigma and not dealing with the norms that discourage help-seeking behaviors, it can lead to some of the things of depression, PTSD, and substance misuse. And oftentimes, as we know, many individuals go undiagnosed, right? And oftentimes, even in spaces where you would say, well, okay, in Jamaica or Trinidad, this is all Black and brown communities. Sometimes we are utilizing approaches that are not rooted in our cultural understanding. And sometimes some of these responses to issues that we are facing are really not culturally responsive. So that's another area as well. As you think about the work that you're doing, how do you ensure that your approaches, your strategies, your tactics, the way that you go about your assessment is rooted within the cultural practice and norms of your given society is something that is important. It is important as practitioner scholars that you question different approaches. It is okay to come up with new approaches. I think Dr. Bobby Wright, well-known Black psychologist here in the United, says that one of the fundamental errors, and he was talking about in the context of Black Americans or Blacks, he said one of the fundamental errors that Black scholars and practitioners often engage in is solely relying on or using white understandings of pathology or understandings of a situation as the sole basis for the analysis and coming up with the best treatment modality. That we really have to dig within ourselves and have an understanding of how to come up with new ways to deal with old problems and issues. So as you think about mental health, men often face unique stresses, as I said. Within the North American context, we're talking about discrimination, socioeconomic challenges. But I say that these are also prevalent in the Caribbean because we talked about intersectionality of race and class, right, and gender. We cannot exclude that. We cannot exclude how those remnants of coloniality still linger with us in our societies, right? And they impact how men deal with stress or perceive the stress that they're faced with, right? And we also talked about depression and PTSD. Higher exposure to traumatic events and chronic stress can lead to mental health issues, such as depression, as we've highlighted before. So we know that in our society, there are societal expectations around men, right? To be strong, don't cry, to man up, or be a man, right? Suppressing emotions can also lead to isolation and internalized pain, right? Grew up in a culture where you don't cry, man don't cry, it's a mama man, different things, right? So people begin to put forward stereotypes or assumptions, oftentimes rooted, I would say, very much in a Eurocentric frame of paradigm of what it means to be a man, right? And for people, particularly who are coming out of an experience, colonization, oppression, right? That we also inherit some of these warped views about manhood and what it means to be a man. right? And we need to begin to question that paradigm, right? In terms of what it really means to be a man, and look at whose paradigm are we using to define that, right? The fear of being perceived weak, right, can also be a barrier to healing, as I've mentioned before. The other thing that you asked me to address, and media, music, and masculinity, right? So we see that within the context of Black originated music, I encourage you to go see the movie Sinners. It's an excellent movie. Why? It covers and documents the impact of the griot and how that tradition, which was brought to the Americas, the Caribbean, Latin America, South America, Central America, and its manifestation in from ska, mento, to reggae, to kaiso, to calypso, to soca, to rapso, to the blues, to R&B, to now hip hop, right? What we see is that within the context of our culture, we have manifested or devolved, right? Because it didn't start off that way, but now we have devolved in terms of our culture, in terms of how the media and the music portray masculinity. And unfortunately, one of the things without stealing, the thunder of what Sinner shows, it also shows how people can usurp our culture, and have us to be doing things that are very much contrary to what we should be doing in our culture, right? So as we look at dancehall and hip hop, I love dancehall. I love Trinidad. Hey, it is what it is. I grew up on Cartel, right? I grew up on Buju. I grew up on Major Worries, right? I grew up on all these artists as a young man in Trinidad in the 1980s, and then moving to Brooklyn, the Republic of Brooklyn, which I call it the Republic of the Caribbean, because everybody is there, right? So you get to embrace and understand everybody's culture, right? But what we have seen consistently over the years is a devolution in terms of how the music, in terms of the uplift, because the individuals who have the money, who influence on music, that is not what they want to hear, right? So in order to sell what people want to hear in the streets is what we see now, right? Which is about killing your ups, which is about doing this, circling this man ends, taking out this one, right? So when we look at all the pictures here, where there's Skilly Bang, and I love Skilly Bang, but all these fellas singing is gunman tune. And the same thing in Trinidad. Trinidad is only about gunman, right? And the picture below, you see there Rebel 6, Prince Swanee, and Plumpy Boss. Rebel 6 killed in the early stages of Trinidad, right? Swanee no longer lives in Trinidad. He can't come to Trinidad. Plumpy Boss was shot in his head, right? So we recognize the impact of media, music, and masculinity, and the impact it has on us, right, in terms of our mental health as well, right? So these are some of the things. The media shapes identity and limits vulnerability. So we always feel we have to be hyper. Vybz Kartel made an important comment where he said, I think he was in Guyana, and he asked the young generation, such as yourself, to reject that violence. Somebody mashes shoes, you don't have to go and get a gun and kill them and all them kind of things like that, right? Where we need to get back to love, but we also have to understand that the music right now is not projecting that, and there are multiple areas, factors that influence that. But that is another impact on men's health in the region.